Let me begin by again saying how pleased I am to be here as an alumnus of the Vanderbilt Divinity School and the PhD program in religion. It's an honor to see some faces I know and many, of course, that I don't, but also an honor to be asked to address this audience. I've got to say also that I'm pleased for the opportunity to thank the facilities of the Library of Congress, where much of the research was done that went into both of the presentations. It's one of the best places in the world for the serious study of the cultural history of humanity, and for someone who's interested in the history of the Bible, a tremendous repository of great riches. 4 years from now, the English-speaking world will mark the 400th anniversary of the publication of a translation of the Christian scriptures that on its original title page was described as, and catch your breath, the Holy Bible containing the Old Testament and the New, newly translated out of the original tongues and with the former translations diligently compared and revised by His Majesty's special commandment, approved to be read in churches. So was born in 1611 the King James Version of the Bible, and so was decisively altered the course of the English language, the imaginative universe of the English-speaking people, and somewhat later the history of the United States of America. If doubts arise about the continuing presence of this old book in the contemporary United States, it is enough to take note of the most impressive life and times yet to be published for the modern American who probably enjoys the greatest respect in the whole world. I'm referring to Taylor Branch's justly praised 3-volume work on Martin Luther King Jr., America in the King Years. Of its 3 parts, one is titled with a direct quotation from the King James Version, Pillar of Fire, and the other 2 use slightly modernized phrases that were originally burned into American consciousness by their place in the KJV, parting the waters and at Canaan's edge. Or think about the arguments propounded by Kevin Phillips in his recent and controversial bestseller, American Theocracy. One of Phillips' major contentions is that the Republican Party in recent years has been decisively influenced by a dispensational, premillennial interpretation of the Bible. This interpretation, with its fateful implications for Middle Eastern conflict and many other matters, became a fixture in America through annotated editions of the James Version, through countless prophecy conferences featuring expositions from this same translation. Yet if the King James Version remains a force to be reckoned with, it is also obvious that the translation no longer dominates Bible reading or is no longer so obviously influential on the language of American public life as once was the case. And so we are left with an important question about American culture as a whole. What are the consequences as the King James Version, which for so long was such a key reference point for our language and such an important influence on our society's religious, moral, and literary habits of mind, now fades from the center of American culture? But first, in an effort to gauge the general significance of this translation, it is a useful point of historical reference to highlight some of the commentary that appeared in 1911 at the 300th anniversary of the King James Version's original publication. At that time, nearly universal opinion held that this one book had exerted an incalculably decisive influence on Anglo-American civilization. In the American Review of Reviews that year, as one example, the claim was made that, compared with all other books, compared even with all other Bibles, it is the most noble, beautiful, and wonderful book which the world holds today. The history of the book for many centuries is interwoven with the national history of freedom and independence and personal religion. Therefore, it is to us also and essentially our national book. In 1911, some of the most widely noticed statements about the King James Version came from the summit of the political world. Within days of each other, in the spring of 1911, the sitting governor of New Jersey and the former governor of New York both made substantial addresses on the significance of the King James Version. Historians ought to take special note of these speeches, since they were given by the only 2 presidents of the American Historical Association who also served as presidents of the United States. Former President Theodore Roosevelt spoke at the Pacific Theological Seminary in Berkeley, California, while soon-to-be President Woodrow Wilson addressed a crowd of 12,000 in Denver during a nationwide journey exploring the possibilities of a presidential run. To Roosevelt, as a good historian, it was important to show how much the King James Version put to use earlier translations, but he was also characteristically dramatic in what he wanted to say about this one version. No other book of any kind ever written in English, perhaps no other book ever written in any other tongue, has ever so affected the whole life of a people as this authorized version of the Scriptures has affected the life of the English-speaking peoples. To specify why reading from the King James Version would build character, Roosevelt quoted from the great scientist Huxley, as he called him, who had called the King James Version the Magna Carta of the poor and the oppressed, the most democratic book of the world. Of course, Roosevelt conceded the Bible's content was important for formal doctrine, and of course its language was important aesthetically, but for him all other purposes fell far short of the ethical, and so he closed with these words: "Our success in striving to help our fellow men and therefore to help ourselves depends largely upon our success as we strive with whatever shortcomings, with whatever failures, to lead our lives in accordance with the great ethical principles laid down in the life of Christ and in the New Testament writings which seek to expound and apply his teachings." Woodrow Wilson's speech to the Denver throng was just as conclusive, if a little more wordy. As Wilson summarized matters to a correspondent immediately afterwards, "I spoke on the Bible in progress, and the great audience moved me deeply. The Bible, with its individual value of the human soul, is undoubtedly the book that has made democracy and has been the source of all progress." To Wilson, as to Roosevelt, the King James Version inculcated a particular kind of morality. It had revealed, Wilson's phrase, men unto themselves, not as creatures in bondage, but as distinct moral agents. Because the Bible was no respecter of persons, Wilson concluded that not a little of the history of liberty lies in the circumstance that the moving sentences of this book were made familiar to the ears and the understanding of those peoples who have led mankind in exhibiting the forms of government and the impulses of reform which have made for freedom and for self-government among mankind. At the end of his address, Wilson, like Roosevelt, conflated what he wanted to say about the Bible as a general guide for American civilization and his own stance as a Christian reader of the Scriptures. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a very simple thing to ask of you. I ask of every man and woman in this audience that from this night they will realize that part of the destiny of America lies in their daily perusal of this great book of Revelations, that if they would see America free and pure, they will make their own spirits free and pure by this baptism of the Holy Scripture. These pillars of political society were making bold claims for the influence of the King James Version on American life. They could speak without nuance because they knew that the era's mainstream American opinion agreed with them. What they and other commentators in 1911 were reflecting was a common awareness that the King James Version had occupied a permanent place at the center of public life so long as there had been a public life in the United States. To them, this one version of the Scriptures had provided the canopy under which American ideals had flourished. Now, almost a century later, it is easier to see where the statements that they uttered needed qualification. It's first of all necessary to remember that the history of the Bible in America has always been much more than just the history of the King James Version. The Scriptures have always occupied a central place in religious communities that did not use this translation, among, for instance, American Roman Catholics, who long employed the Douay, Challoner, Reims translations, among American Jews, who have produced a number of significant translations of the Hebrew Scriptures, or among church communities using languages other than English, for whom publication of Scripture has always been a major enterprise. Native American populations have contributed a particularly important strand to the American Bible story that is not connected to the King James Version. Spanish Franciscans were translating biblical liturgies and Catholic devotional literature for the Rimacuan Indians of Florida in the 16th and very early 17th centuries, even before permanent English settlement existed in New England. And later in American history, the Bible has been published in Algonquin, Apache, Cherokee, Cheyenne, Choctaw, Dakota, Hopi, Inupiat, Iroquoian, Kuskokwim, Mohawk, Muskogee, Navajo, Ojibwa, and still other Native American languages. Yet with such qualifications having been made, it is still the case that the impact of the one English translation from 1611 has been all but incalculable. Wherever one looks, the King James Version has been there, for example, simply as a business. Once American printers began publishing their own editions of the King James Version after the War for Independence, they began an industry that booms on to this day, and in no place more boomingly than in Nashville. Mason Weems, who is famous for making up the story about George Washington and the cherry tree, earned his living mostly as a traveling Bible salesman. Shortly after 1800, Weems wrote from Virginia to his publisher in Philadelphia about the various King James editions he was retailing. "I tell you," he wrote, "this is the very season and age of the Bible. Bible dictionaries, Bible tales, Bible stories, Bibles plain or paraphrased, Carey's Bibles, Collins' Bibles, Clark's Bibles, Kempter's Bibles, no matter what or whose, all will go down. So wide is the crater of public appetite at this time." Printing of the King James Version continues to be a major business to this day, even with the multitude of other translations competing for public attention. Overall, publishing statistics are hard to come by for the Bible publishing industry, but at least 3 of the 4 major firms in this industry each gross over $100 million annually from Bible sales, and the total take from all publishers is probably more than $1 billion each year. And that total, although the King James Version is no longer the #1 bestseller, it and its revisions still constitute a very substantial percentage. The impact of the King James Version is also underscored by its impression on the physical landscape. The designation of American places with names taken from this translation was especially prominent in the early 19th century as settlers spread westward throughout the continent. And so we have Zoar, Ohio, from Genesis 13:10, Ruma, Illinois, from 2 Kings 23:36, Mount Tirzah, North Carolina, from Joshua 12:24, Zela, West Virginia, from Joshua 18:28, the one I like a lot, Promised Land, Arkansas, from Deuteronomy 9:28, as well as 14 variations on Bethany, 16 on Bethlehem, 17 on Beulah, 47 on Bethel, 61 on Eden, and 95 on Salem. It's also well known that many of the United States' most culturally ambitious writers have regularly employed the phrases of the King James Version to convey powerful sentiments with extraordinary verbal economy. So Herman Melville began Moby Dick with the narrator's simple but highly charged reference to a story from the Hebrew Scriptures, "Call me Ishmael." So Nathaniel Hawthorne and Walt Whitman both entitled significant works Adam. Ernest Hemingway drew on Ecclesiastes 1:5 for his title, "The Sun Also Rises." William Faulkner echoed the King James Version with his works Absalom, Absalom, 2 Samuel 19:4, and Go Down Moses, Exodus 19:21. Eugene O'Neill and Sylvia Plath each used the title Lazarus. Peter DeVries in 1961 published Blood of the Lamb, Revelation 12:11. And in 2005, Marilyn Robinson was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in Literature for Gilead, Jeremiah 8:22. For these excellent authors, the ability to evoke vast worlds of meaning with a simple phrase depended on widespread reading, not just in the Bible per se, but the Bible is known from the King James Version. The Bible usually as the KJV, has fueled an inexhaustible appetite for popular communication expressed in songs, poems, stories, and movies, and by talents large and small. In the visual arts, familiarity with the King James Version provided a ready-made market for prints by lithographers like Currier and Ives, countless painters at all levels of ability, and a few masters acclaimed by both public and critics, like Edward Hicks, who in the mid-19th century painted several versions of The Peaceable Kingdom. Since the beginning of mass-marketed religious objects about the time of the Civil War, both Catholics and Protestants have purchased immense quantities of pictures, statues, games, children's toys, paperweights, refrigerator magnets, jewelry, clothing, T-shirts, greeting cards, calendars, and business cards decorated with biblical motifs. At least for Protestants, the King James Version has been the primary fountain pouring forth text for adorning these popular items. About such materials, Eileen Stuart Fye once observed that there is often a ludicrous discrepancy between the ancient wisdom of the Scriptures and the vulgarities of American popular culture. But Fye did not think this was merely casting pearls before swine, since, in her opinion, these vulgarities show the profound ways in which the holy books of the Jewish and Christian religions relate to the lives of Americans. From the beginning, the King James Version has also provided themes for Americans to define themselves politically, both as a people and then as a nation. Puritans in New England, who by 1650 were using this version exclusively, thought they were in covenant with God, just like the Jews of the Old Testament. During the American Revolution, countless preachers exploited the words of the King James Version to drive home their vision of a liberated America. For example, in 1774, a Presbyterian sermon on tea took Colossians 2:21 for its text. Touch not, taste not, handle not. These creative uses of phrases from the same version have been repeated from time to time at moments both great and small in American history. Early in the Civil War, as one instance, a zealous Southerner teased 2 Chronicles 6:34 and 35, which is King Solomon's prayer for success in battle for Israel, into a biblically worded commentary on the current crisis. He wrote, 11 tribes sought to go forth in peace from the house of political bondage, but the heart of our modern Pharaoh is hardened, that he will not let Israel go. Significantly, these political uses of the King James Version are by no means restricted to ancient history. On January 20th, 1961, John F. Kennedy quoted the King James Version twice at strategic places in his presidential inaugural address. First from Isaiah 58:6 with reference to the communist world, let both sides unite to heed in all corners of the earth the command of Isaiah to undo the heavy burdens and let the oppressed go free. And then from Romans 12:12, in urging his hearers to respond to the trumpet that summons citizens to bear the burden of a long twilight struggle year in and year out, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation. 4 years later, Lyndon Baines Johnson ended his inaugural address by quoting 2 Chronicles 1:10. For myself, I ask only in the words of an ancient leader, give me now wisdom and knowledge that I may go out and come in before this people, for who can judge this, thy people, that is so great? And then in 4 more years, Richard Nixon, near the close of his inaugural, quoted Malachi 4:2 from the Revised Standard Modernization of the King James Version. The peace we seek is not victory over any other people, but the peace that comes with healing in its wings. Both Nixon and Johnson took the presidential oath of office with their hands placed on a King James Version Bible open to Isaiah 2:4. And he shall judge among the nations and shall rebuke many people, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. At the current moment, when it's tempting to think that the Bible has become a campaign document of the Republican Party, it's helpful to remember that then Governor Bill Clinton, in his acceptance speech at the Democratic National Convention in July 1992, twice quoted passages from the Bible, including one directly from the King James Version, Proverbs 29:18, where there is no vision, the people perish. And he used at least 3 other phrases from the King James at strategic moments in his address. Eye of the Lord from Genesis 6, keep this faith from Revelation 14, and new covenant from Jeremiah 31. When American public figures quote or allude to the scriptures, they are only following a long tradition that includes the absolute high points of American public rhetoric. We talked last night about how Martin Luther King Jr. in the great I Have a Dream speech, and Abraham Lincoln in the second inaugural skillfully deployed passages from the King James Version and then in the King's instance, the Revised Version, to make their most important points. King quoted Amos 5:24, justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty dream, and Isaiah 44, every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, to build the high platform from which he would dream about a more just nation. For Abraham Lincoln, quotations from the King James Version constituted the living skeleton for the whole of this incomparable address. Genesis 3:19, wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. Matthew 18:7, woe unto the world because of offenses. Matthew 7:1, judge not that we be not judged. And Psalm 19:9, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. For American politics, the King James Version, either quoted directly or as a model of discourse, could not be more significant. Before we move from how the King James Version has molded American civilization to understanding our considerably different situation today, it is necessary to clarify 2 important matters. The first is historical. When we speak of the King James Version, it's necessary always to bear in mind that we really mean the whole tradition of Bible translations that culminated in 1611 with this version. King James I wanted a translation of the Scriptures that would unite his kingdom, and he wanted a version without marginal annotations. His sensitivity at this point arose directly from the Geneva Bible of 1560, which was then the most popular version of the Scriptures. Its voluminous marginal notes included many sharp denunciations of kings who oppressed their people. And King James wanted no more of that. So the key thing for him and his advisors was a version that could be universally accepted and that would not lead the English people to question their king. This political situation meant that the 3 teams of translators James put to work at Oxford, Cambridge, and London were free to use the best work of previous translations just so long as the political overtones of these earlier translations were obscured. So it was that the King James Version included a whole raft of words that had entered written English with the translation made by the followers of John Wycliffe in the late 14th century, that it incorporated a very great deal of specific phrasing from William Tyndale's translations of the New Testament, the Pentateuch, and the historical books of the Old Testament, dating from the 1520s and 1530s, and that it liberally used many other words and phrases from a number of other 16th century translations, including both the Catholic Douay-Rheims version and the Calvinist Geneva Bible, which were produced by communities that James very much distrusted. Even then, what appeared in 1611 was not quite yet the King James Version. As David Norton has recently pointed out in a model of detailed scholarship, it was not until the 1760s that careful textual criticism stabilized the network of variable versions that had all descended from the original 1611 printings of this one translation. Thus, when we speak of King James Version English, we really mean the language that was given a permanent shape by the popularity of this translation, but which actually represented a harvest of earlier Bible translations fixed as the King James Version only after more than a century of textual fine-tuning. The puzzling consequences of this complicated textual history can be illustrated whenever Christian believers from different liturgical traditions recite together the Lord's Prayer from Matthew chapter 6. Some will say, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors," which is the King James reading, taking over from a 1535 translation by Miles Coverdale. But others still recite, "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us," which was William Tyndale's rendering from the mid-1520s. If a certain sophistication concerning textual matters is necessary for understanding the history of the King James Version, it is even more imperative to keep in mind a more basic reality. That reality is religious. The tremendous business sustained by publications of the King James Version, the deep well of reverence that this translation is always supplied for the deep well of reference that the version is always supplied for American literature, the central role of the King James Version in popular culture of all kinds, and the King James Version persistent usefulness to the political powers that be, all depend upon what the millions of its readers learn from its pages about God, about themselves before God, and about themselves under God in relation to their fellow human beings. The recently deceased Yaroslav Pelikan often wrote about such matters with his clear as crystal precision. In one of his last books, this judicial scholar describes succinctly the religious root from which has grown the public fruit of this one translation's influence. The Bible, Pelikan wrote, is a strange new world because it confronts us with a God who speaks, but who in the very act of self-revelation is and remains the wholly other one. My plans are not your plans, nor are my words your words, declares the Lord. Isaiah 55, verse 8. What Pelikan said should be obvious, though it bears repeating. There would be no reason to ponder the significance of the King James Version in American history if this translation had not played such an all-important role for countless Americans as they considered themselves before the living God. But now, during the last half-century, we have come into a new situation that affects both religious believers and the public at large. For believers who read the Bible because they think it reveals the root of the matter spiritually, a cornucopia, or perhaps a perfect Babel, of modern translations competes for the space once dominated by the King James Version. To be sure, several of the modern translations represent modernizations of the KJV, including the Revised Standard Version of 1952, the New American Standard Bible of 1973, the New Revised Standard Version of 1990, the New American Standard Bible Update 1995, and the English Standard Version of 2001. These translations in turn rely to varying degrees on earlier updatings, the Revised Version of 1881, 1885, and the American Standard Version of 1901. But the Bible reading public also has available at least 25 other newer translations produced under largely Christian auspices, as well as a 1985 translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, Tanakh, sponsored by the Jewish Publication Society. A few of these newer translations, like the Living Bible or the New International Version, have sold into the tens or even hundreds of millions, and all within the last decades. The positive result from this plethora of new versions is significant. The Bible now speaks as a much more contemporaneous book and also a much more understandable book than when it was restricted to the language of the early 17th century. Yet current practice works like a two-edged sword. The proliferation of texts disqualifies any one of them from speaking with natural familiarity to those who use other versions. The once common practice of scriptural memorization has become hopelessly confused, and debates over which new translation best captures the original Hebrew and Greek sometimes turns nasty, with that particular venom reserved for those who believe almost, but not exactly, what I believe. For the public at large, different dynamics are at work. To put a complex matter simplistically, the linguistic and narrative place that for more than 2 centuries had been occupied by the King James translation is now substantially filled by the omnipresent electronic media. To be sure, Bible-based materials, like Mel Gibson's film Passion, or the Jesus film from Campus Crusade for Christ, which has been seen over 6 billion times by members of the world's population, often more than once, or a number of successful children's adaptations of Bible stories like VeggieTales, do compete fairly well in the new electronic marketplace. But the domains that have been most successfully popularized by television, the movies, and the internet are sport, crime, pornography, politics, warfare, medicine, and the media itself. Within these domains, there is minimal place for biblical themes of any sort, much less the ancient language of the King James Version. Contrast between the contemporary situation and the situation commemorated in 1911 by Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt are striking. Then, most Americans knew about the King James Version, and a great proportion of the national population repeatedly read or heard at least parts of this one book, but few Americans had ever seen the country's president except as a photo in the newspaper. Now, most Americans see the president on television several times a week, while considerably fewer read any translation of the Bible every week, and even fewer study the King James Version. Then, the King James Version was the single most important source for the words, phrases, and rhetorical forms of the middle and higher ranges of the common speech. Now, when the language of the King James Version is recognized, it often sounds archaic, dated, antiquarian, or simply quaint. Then, phrases from the King James Version were everywhere in regular use, and the origin of these phrases as the Bible was widely recognized. Now, often repeated phrases are more likely to come from a consumer culture dominated by the media. So, make my day, where's the beef, beam me up, Scotty, or when we speak of the DNA or the hard wiring of an organization, describe a political full-court press, or media blitz, or refer to X-rated testimony, or softball questions, or Google for an obscure fact. The rhetorical world that Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson could take for granted is no more. For a surprisingly numerous cloud of American witnesses, this demise of the King James Version was long overdue. James Hudson of the Library of Congress has recently published a splendid little book with well-authenticated quotations from the American founders on religious matters. In its wealth of fascinating commentary are found several surprisingly negative opinions about the King James Version. John Adams, for example, once attacked the belief that any one version of the Bible could count as a true rule of faith. He began his argument by denouncing the translation by King James I as being carried out by someone who was more than half a Catholic, which in 1816 was for Adams anything but a compliment. Benjamin Rush, the Philadelphia physician who helped heal the breach between Adams and Thomas Jefferson, once warned parents away from the KJV by calling it, in effect, R-rated. There are, I grant, several chapters and many verses in the Old Testament which in their present unfortunate translation should be passed over by children. And Benjamin Franklin once tried his hand at translating a passage from the book of Job because he held that the language in the King James Version is much changed, and its style, being obsolete and thence less agreeable, is perhaps one reason why the reading of that excellent book is of late so much neglected. Needless to say, no one abandoned the KJV to take up the New Bible by Benton. John Adams' disparagement of James I as a Roman Catholic points to a more serious reason why some Americans might be delighted to see this translation pass from the scene. Catholics could be first in line. As my Notre Dame colleague John McGreevy has pointed out in his compelling book, Catholics in American Freedom, there is a long history of American civil strife driven by the mandated use of the King James Version in public institutions, especially the public schools. McGreevy, in fact, begins this book with an account of the Eliot School Rebellion of 1859, which was sparked when an assistant to the principal at a Boston public school used a rattan stick to bloody the hands of a 10-year-old boy, Thomas Wall, when Wall refused to recite the Ten Commandments from the King James Version. Wall's priest and his parents did not object to reciting the Ten Commandments as such. They did object to the mandatory use of the Protestants' King James Version for this recitation. A few decades later, in 1886, Catholic parents in Edgerton, Wisconsin, filed suit against the local school board to stop mandatory readings from the KJV. The board replied that reading this translation without comment gave all children the right to interpret the Bible as they pleased. In agreeing with the school board, a local judge stated that the King James Version's very presence as a believed book has rendered the nation's having it a chosen race, and then too in exact proportion as it is more or less generally known and studied. Even though this ruling was reversed by the Wisconsin Supreme Court, it testified to a Protestant coercive spirit and a Protestant cultural obtuseness that gave constant offense to Catholic citizens, and all because they were loyal to a different translation of the Bible. It was the same for Jews. Before the Civil War, Rabbi Isaac Wise of Cincinnati, who also opposed Bible reading in the public schools, nonetheless suggested that if the practice was judged necessary for the health of the Republic, the most neutral solution was to read the original versions each day in Hebrew and Greek. A few years later, Wise was joined by another prominent Reform rabbi, Max Lilienthal, to support the Cincinnati School Board's decision to eliminate Bible readings. His reason pointed again to the evil effects of coercion. We are opposed to Bible reading in the schools. We want secular schools and nothing else. The state cannot impose any religious instruction on its citizens. Other reformers who also felt that the King James Version had been used as a tool of repression joined in this same chorus. As early as 1837, Sarah Grimke was appealing for a translation to replace the King James Version, which she felt had obscured the Bible's message of liberation for women. Grimke professed an eager willingness to live by the Bible, but she also believed that, in her words, almost everything that has been written on this subject has been the result of a misconception of the simple truths revealed in the Scriptures in consequence of the false translation of many passages of Holy Writ. King James translators certainly were not inspired. I therefore claim the original as my standard, believing that to have been inspired. The cause for complaint among African Americans went even deeper, since liberal quotation from the King James Version undergirded the institutions of American slavery. Thus, it was no surprise when in 1899, Henry McNeil Turner, a bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, called for a new translation. His complaint was that the white man had colored the Bible in his translation to suit the white man and made it in many respects objectionable to the Negro. And until a company of learned black men shall rise up and retranslate the Bible, it will not be wholly acceptable and in keeping with the higher conception of the black man. We need a new translation of the Bible for colored churches. The bitter relevance of Turner's appeal was underscored shortly thereafter and from the highest reaches of the land. In 1916, President Wilson responded positively to an invitation to take part in a 100th anniversary celebration for the American Bible Society, which was scheduled for the Daughters of the American Revolution building in Washington, D.C. Before this event could take place, there was, in the words of a Bible Society official, one difficult corner to turn, the color question. The official explained to this staunchly segregationist president that as a national organization having an agency among colored people with a colored minister at its head, we have certain obligations which we cannot avoid. Despite the sense of duty expressed in this letter, it came to pass on May 7, 1916, that because of unrecorded backstage maneuvering, the president addressed the society with no blacks on the platform. On that occasion, the same Wilson who in 1911 had praised the King James Version because of how these pages teem with the masses of mankind, these are the annals of the people, of the common run of man, now spoke loftily of how the Word of God was weaving the spirits of men together throughout the whole world. Yet if what was then so commonly accepted about how to treat the races, but now is seen as so reprehensible, was linked to the ever-present use of the King James Version, then the loss of this version might not be considered much of a loss at all. More than just the coercive and discriminatory use of the King James Version might encourage observers today to conclude that it is simply a good thing for this translation to have passed from general use. From the side of Protestants who believe in the truth of Scripture as divine revelation, It may be good for their own religious health to redraw a stronger line between the Bible's relevance for religion and its relevance for public life. When the phrases of the King James Version came naturally to one and sundry, all too many believers assumed that it was the nation's responsibility to do the business of the church, and the church's responsibility to do the business of the nation. But that assumption could easily become a threat to the religious integrity of both church and nation. A notable foreign visitor in the 1930s concluded his own largely appreciative commentary on American Christian believers with something like that criticism. The visitor was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who had many words of praise for religion in the United States, but who also observed that the American separation of church and state was linked with an extraordinary participation of the churches in the political, social, economic, and cultural events of public life. To Bonhoeffer, the nature of that activity made him ask whether American Christians understood the negative criticism of the Christian gospel. As he put it in his essay from 1939, American believers do not understand that God's criticism touches even religion. In American theology, Christianity is still essentially religion and ethics. But because of this, the person and work of Christ must, for theology, sink into the background and in the long run remain misunderstood, because it is not recognized as a sole ground of radical judgment and radical forgiveness. To paraphrase Bonhoeffer, it might be said that the King James Version had to die as an American public book before the Bible could rise again as the church's particular book. For unbelievers of the public at large, there is a parallel criticism. When the language of the King James Version was everywhere the common public language, it was very easy to bestow a sacred aura on public discourse. This happened with a vengeance during the American Civil War and has happened other times since. The sacralization of public rhetoric easily leads to an absolutization of public principle. And the absolutization of public principle leads easily to the demonization of opponents, which in turn promotes crusading at home and abroad. When in the mid-1920s the Frenchman André Siegfried visited the United States, he did not comment directly on the use of the King James Bible, but he did comment on an American public style that was everywhere expressed in the language of this translation. Not only, he said, do Americans believe that they have been called to uplift the outside world, a duty toward savages, Negroes, and Frenchmen, but they also feel the need to evangelize their own community by means of crusades against cigarettes, alcohol, and the slums, and such movements as feminism, pacifism, anti-vivisection, Americanization of immigrants, and even the gospel of eugenics and birth control. What Siegfried described as a Puritan evangelical tendency explained for him an American political style that so often perplexed Europeans. He wrote, "Every American is at heart an evangelist, be he a Wilson, a Bryan, or a Rockefeller. He cannot leave people alone, and he constantly feels the urge to preach. For the sake of a calmer, more self-critical public discourse, it may therefore be good that the King James Version is passing away." And yet, the history of the King James Version in American life is only partially a history of headlong crusading, high-minded hypocrisy, and the enervated blurring of spiritual and political kingdoms. It is only partially a history from which believers and non-believers may wish to be liberated. An indication of the positive legacy of this one translation comes from surprising witnesses, including Catholics and Jews, who made Bible translations of their own in order to provide substitutes for the KJV. Thus, in the mid-19th century, when Bishop Francis Kenrick of Philadelphia set himself the task of providing a full translation of the Bible for Roman Catholics, he praised the King James Version and said that, "In things indifferent, conformity to this translation is desirable, since every approach to uniformity in the rendering of the inspired word without sacrifice of principle or violation of disciplinary rules is a gain to the common cause of Christianity." A few decades later, when American Jews began work on the translation that was eventually published in 1917 as the Holy Scriptures according to the Masoretic text, Solomon Schechter and other members of the translation committee went out of their way to praise the King James Version, even as they set out their rationale for a Jewish-sponsored translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. What such Catholics and Jews saw as they went about preparing replacements for the KJV was a simple fact of American history. Because the King James Version enjoyed a nearly universal availability, the Bible message it conveyed could never truly be monopolized by any one group of users. This fact lay behind the all but unfathomable profusion of uses to which the King James Version has been put throughout American history. This fact explains why time and again the KJV has inspired spiritual liberation and also sometimes social and political liberation that other American interests sought to curtail. A very few random examples from a bottomless reservoir can illustrate what this liberation has meant. When in the 1890s, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and other prominent feminists published the Woman's Bible, they enlisted commentary from a broad array of prominent American women. Their Bible promoted the reinterpretation or the overthrow of scriptural texts that, in the editor's view, had done women harm. But from at least one of the invited contributors, Stanton received an unexpected answer. Frances Willard, head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was then at the height of her influence as a reformer, active not only against alcohol abuse, but also on behalf of women's and children's rights more generally. Her reply to Stanton was a sophisticated defense of the Bible. No such woman, she wrote, as Mrs. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, with her heart aflame against all forms of injustice and of cruelty, has ever been produced in a country where the Bible was not incorporated into the thoughts and the affections of the people, and had not been so during many generations. To be sure, Willard agreed that the Scriptures had often been used to demean women, but she also affirmed that the Bible made possible, in her phrases, a hallowed motherhood, because it raises woman up, and with her lifts toward heaven the world. It has produced the finest characters which I have ever known. Willard's defense of the Bible, which in her era meant also a defense of the King James Version, has been even more impressive when coming from African Americans, the victims who, as a whole, have suffered most from coercive use of the King James Version. Despite that usage, it is difficult to overestimate the importance of the King James Bible for African Americans. To this day, even with the great variety of translations now available, Bibles aimed at black Americans regularly retain the King James Version. The reason is because this translation has been an indispensable mainstay, as it was, for example, to Julia A. Foote, a black evangelist in the latter half of the 19th century who was converted while reading the King James Version and who found strength in its pages throughout her life. Here is an account from her autobiography of a sad day on which her husband left for a long sea voyage. While under this apparent cloud, I took the Bible to my closet, asking divine aid. As I opened the book, my eyes fell on these words, "For thy Maker is thy husband." I then read the 54th chapter of Isaiah over and over again. It seemed to me that I had never seen it before. I went forth glorifying God. Albert Rabbitoe records a similar story from about the same time that concerns a freed slave in Beaufort, North Carolina. This still illiterate woman carried a big Bible about with her through the woods and swamps. Her former mistress had helped her by turning down the leaves at the verses she knew by heart. And often she would sit down in the woods and open the big Bible at these verses and repeat them aloud and find strength and consolation. One of the most memorable of such African-American testimonies was offered on September 7, 1864, at the White House, when Abraham Lincoln entertained a committee of loyal blacks from Baltimore for a presentation. The object presented was a pulpit edition of the King James Version, bound in violet-tinted velvet, furnished with gold and with a raised design depicting the emancipation of a slave. The book cost far more than the average per capita income of a white American. What the delegation's chairman, the Reverend S.W. Chase, said to the president was memorable, both for how the gift reflected gratitude to Lincoln, but also for how thoroughly the words, messages, and cadences of the King James Version had been incorporated into the speaker's consciousness. And this is what he said. "Mr. President, The loyal colored people of Baltimore have entrusted us with the authority to present this Bible as a testimonial of their appreciation of your humane conduct towards the people of our race. We come to present to you this copy of the Holy Scriptures, a token of respect for your active participation in the furtherance of the cause of the emancipation of our race. This great event will be a matter of history. Hereafter, when our children shall ask what mean these tokens, they will be told of your worthy deeds, and will rise up and call you blessed. The loyal colored people of this country everywhere will remember you at the throne of divine grace. May the King eternal and all-wise providence protect and keep you, and when you pass from this world to that of eternity, may you be borne to the bosom of your Savior and your God. In reply, Lincoln himself said some interesting things about the Bible, but nothing as revealing of the empowering force of the King James Version as what the Reverend Chase had said to him. The great influence of the King James Version in American history came precisely because it was so widely available, precisely because its words, and what the words communicated, had entered so deeply into the consciousness of so many Americans, and particularly of otherwise voiceless Americans. If in our era the King James Version is fading as a universal presence, both linguistic and religious, something foundational is being lost for American civilization. Some of that loss is for the good. Much can only be cause for regret. Yet even the eclipse of the King James Version by other Bible translations and its passing as an easily recognizable public icon is not the end of the story. In this lecture today, I have quoted approximately 43 different words, names, phrases, and passages from the King James Version. Beside these quotations, the lecture has also contained at least another 52 words and phrases that were fixed in the English language because they appeared in the King James Version. Most of them actually appeared in earlier versions, but they were given their final launch into Common English through the KJV. These words and phrases range from those with a recognizable biblical sound, like casting pearls before swine, or a two-edged sword, or the powers that be, to many words and phrases whose origin in the King James Version is now all but completely obscured. Such terms which represent the silent legacy of the King James Version today include the words humanity, argument, offend, canopy, city, and many more. All words that gained a permanent place in standard English because they were part of the King James Version tradition. If the King James Version is now passing from the scene, nonetheless, the language it contributed to American public speech endures. Such an unrecognized legacy may seem inconsequential. Surely, if we do not realize consciously where words come from, we can no longer be influenced by that unrecognized source. Maybe so. But philologists will know the difference, and maybe a latter-day Francis Willard or Julia Foote or Reverend S.W. Chase, maybe an Abraham Lincoln or a Martin Luther King Jr. Ray DeVivus, may also someday once again read, mark, and inwardly digest words of this or another translation of the sacred text. And maybe the results from those readings will also extend some of the great good that the King James Version has worked in, for, and by the American people. Thank you. Question, yes? Yes. The numbering of chapters and verses actually comes very late in the history of the Bible, but it's in place at the beginning of American history. My understanding is that chapter divisions are not fixed until the Middle Ages, and verse divisions are not fixed until the mid-16th century. I have seen a facsimile of the first German Bible by Martin Luther, and there are no verse divisions. And I believe that's the case for the first publications of the William Tyndale Bibles. I actually think, and it's a little bit of a hobby horse, that dividing the Bible up into verses fundamentally affected how it was used, especially in a democratic society with broad access to the Scriptures. But that probably is a subject for another day. Sure. The question is about the Masoretic text coming into Greek, probably Septuagint, and the answer to your question is no, I can't speak to that. I've heard that same thing, but my expertise on these issues starts about with when in fact the King James Version was allowed to be published in the United States. It was not published until after the American Revolution because the King's printers at Oxford and Cambridge and London had a monopoly. So anything after about 1775, I'll take a shot at.
Other questions or comments for Professor Noll?
Would you be able to speak to the possibility that in other cultures where the Bible has been translated into a different language and it's the only translation in that language, is there a similar type of effect in those countries?
This is a question with huge contemporary import for the fate of Christianity around the world. I follow on these points the really outstanding work of Laman Sana, the historian of actually Islam and Christianity at the Yale Divinity School. He makes the point that in many places around the world, the translation of the Bible into a native tongue has not only been usually in miniature, but comparable to the broad and deep cultural effects of the King James Version in English, but even more, it has been a major factor in the preservation of local languages threatened by extinction with the use of Chinese, Spanish, French, English, common languages. Having the Scriptures and often other religious literature in native tongues is in fact full of cultural and social as well as religious effects. The main difference from the American story would be that when the King James Version became important in Britain and then in America, worldwide communications was much reduced. And so the availability of the world's, as it were, trade languages was much, much less. And so once the Bible was present in, say, the King James Version, that not only dominated English language use, but usually existed without competition. So one of the reasons that Abraham Lincoln could quote the Bible so well is that his household, when he was growing up with a great thirst for learning, included maybe 3 or 4 books, one of which was a King James Bible, one was a Baptist hymnal, and 1 or 2 other books, and that was it. And so the competition from other sources is now a part of the standard part of the world picture would not have existed, but something of the same cultural and social effect may actually have taken place. I think we're out of time. I thank you for your attention this morning.
Thank you, Professor Noll.